Good evening. I'm Molly Rosenberg, Director of the Royal Society of Literature, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to a joint celebration this evening from the RSL, BoCAS Lit Fest and the British Library as we ask, what's so great about Jean Rhys? This November, as we approach the Royal Society of Literature's 200th birthday and the 10th of the Caribbean NGC BoCAS Lit Fest, our panel of writers this evening discuss the Dominican author Jean Rhys's impact on Caribbean literature and across the globe. An RSL Fellow, Rhys is best known for her 1966 novel Wide Sargasso Sea, which imagined the early life of Bertha Mason from Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre. Yet her writing career spanned decades and forms, from the novel Good Morning Midnight to Smile Please, an unfinished autobiography, published the year that she died. At the RSL, we all feel very glad to be sharing this evening with the NGC BoCAS Lit Fest as it enters 10 years of celebrating Caribbean writers and writing. We're also pleased to be sharing tonight's discussion of all things Rhys with our co-host, the British Library, particularly as this evening's event forms part of the library's exhibition Unfinished Business, The Fight for Women's Rights, exploring how feminist activism today has its roots in the complex history of women's rights. While we aren't able to be together at the British Library as we had originally hoped, everyone watching can send questions as we go on together online. You can do this at the bottom of your screen. So if you scroll down beneath this video, you'll see a box that you can write into, and we'll get to as many of your questions as possible at the end of the discussion. At the top of the screen, I think you will also find a button for the British Library's online bookshop where you can buy our speakers' books as well as Jean Rhys's. Before I hand over to our panel, it is my delight, as ever with Shahida, to introduce tonight's chair. Shahida Barry is a professor at the University of the Arts London, and her book, Dressed, The Secret Life of Clothes, was published in 2019. She's a presenter of BBC Radio 3's Arts and Ideas podcast, Free Thinking, and a judge in 2020 for the Baillie Gifford Prize. Thanks, Shahida. Over to you.
Thanks, Molly. It's so lovely to be here. Hello and welcome to this event on Jean Rhys, organised by the Royal Society of Literature in association with the British Library and the NGC BoCAS Lit Festival. And as Molly suggested, I'm Shahida Bari. I'm an academic and a broadcaster, and I'm your host for the evening. It is, of course, disappointing that we can't be together in person, preferably in the Caribbean, but it's still magical to be able to gather in this way. So many of us in so many different places, I expect. And this is a really wonderful chance to think about Rhys's work and her legacy, and to reflect on her place in both Caribbean and world literature. Let me introduce our panelists today. Lauren Elkin. Lauren, maybe you can wave so people can see you. Lauren is a writer, translator, and academic. Her most recent book, Flanneau's Women Walk the City, was a Radio 4 Book of the Week and a finalist for the Penn Demon Stein Spielvogel Award for the Art of the Essay. She has new work coming too, 91/92, A Diary of a Year on the Bus, and a translation of Simone de Beauvoir's lost novel, The Inseparables. And currently, you're very busy. She's working on her next book, Art Monsters. Linda Grant. Linda, can you wave so people can see you? There's Linda. Linda is a novelist and journalist. She's written 5 non-fiction books and 7 novels. Her first novel, The Cast Iron Shore, won the David Hyam First Novel Prize and was shortlisted for the Guardian Book Prize. The Clothes on Their Backs was shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize in 2008. And she became a Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature in 2014. And Shivanee Ramlochan, I've got that right, I think. Hi, Shivanee. Shivanee is a poet, book blogger, and the book review editor for Caribbean Beat magazine. She's also closely involved with BoCAS Lit Fest, as well as Paper-Based Bookshop, which I'd never heard of, but they are Trinidad's sole speciality Caribbean booksellers, so we all need to find out about them. You can find her reviews on the website Novel Niche, including close readings of Caribbean and queer literature, and her own book, Everyone Knows I Am a Haunting, was shortlisted in the Best Fiction Collection category of the Forward Poetry Prizes in 2008. So hello, Lauren, Linda, and Shivanee. Shivanee, I wonder whether we could start like Jean Rhys in the Caribbean. And of course, we're really fortunate in partnering with the BoCAS Lit Fest for this event. How important a figure is Rhys in Caribbean literature?
Thank you so much, Shahida. I think it's impossible to understate the importance of Jean Rhys. For one thing, she is widely taught across the Caribbean, And more than that, I think that particularly with Wide Sargasso Sea, the sensibility and the force of Rhys's literature have endured in ways that perhaps some people might not have expected, that remain so relevant to the issues of power, subordination, obedience, and who writes what narratives that we're still grappling with, and probably always will in Caribbean space. I mean, not for nothing, and this is a sneak preview of an exciting project that the NGC BoCAS Lit Fest is working on now. They're compiling a list of 100 Caribbean books that impacted tremendously on our lives. And I think I can give away this small secret that Jean Rhys is no stranger on that list. I think, though, that in a year in which we're having this phenomenal event, it's heartbreaking to know that Rhys's childhood home in Dominica was demolished in May to make way for commercial properties. What I find instructive about that is that on the one hand, it is for someone like me an unbearable tragedy, but in looking at the responses of Dominicans, many of which are suffused with grief, there are others that question the legitimacy of Rhys to that climate, to their environment, to the idea of why a white Dominican woman who spent scant time in Dominica should be venerated in a certain way. So the response to Rhys is not just one thing. It's comprised of so many interweaving and complex parts about what makes Caribbean identity and what makes a Caribbean writer.
Yes, we should talk more about that, because it was only, I think, 16 years that she spent, the first 16 years in Dominica. But they, those are formative years, and that story about the house is terribly sad, especially when she's so evocative of place. But let me encourage you all to go back to our beginnings, our own relationships with Rhys. And I wonder whether you can recall when you first read Rhys and what it felt like. I can certainly remember a teacher quietly slipping Wide Sargasso Sea under my elbow not long after I'd read Jane Eyre, and I was really stunned by its complete confidence. But it did take me a long time to realize that there was so much more to Rhys. So when did you first encounter Rhys? Maybe Lauren, you could have a go at that question first.
Yeah, thank you, Shahida, and I'm so pleased to be here with such amazing writers whose work I know and really respect. And talking about Jean Rhys, who, I wrote about this a bit in Flaneuse, in the chapter on Rhys in that book, that I found her when I was about 19 or 20 years old, living in Paris for the first time. And I wandered into Shakespeare and Company, and she was right there on the front table, this like amazing Modigliani portrait that's on the cover of After Leaving Mr. Mackenzie. And it just drew me in. And so that was the first book of hers that I read. And I was just like entranced by this, kind of like stark, sinewy, sensual, and incredibly lush and complex kind of view on the world. I don't know, it was really her kind of attachment to pain, certainly, and her interest in her interrogation of what it is to be a woman in the world, a woman who doesn't quite fit in, and who submits herself to some quite painful experiences, perhaps just for the experience of feeling something. All of that really resonated with me when I was 20 years old. And it has, taken different shapes throughout my life. And, now I'm 42 and I'm still finding new things to love in Jean Rhys's novels. So yeah, it's a long love story, me and Jean.
What about you, Linda?
I first started reading her properly in probably the late 70s, when I was in my 20s, and everyone I knew was reading the 30s novels of Jean Rhys. We were all reading them, and there were only about 4 of them, I think. And we were all really bolshy second wave feminists. And so you might think it was slightly odd that we would be hoovering up this writer who did not contain any feisty feminist heroines that you can root for, which is what publishers are looking for these days. And the essence of a Jean Rhys character is she sits in a room waiting for the postman to deliver her a check, sent by a former lover so she can go and buy a new dress and sit in a cafe and find a new lover. And this is the sort of quintessence of the Jean Rhys novel. So it was very unusual that we should have been so fascinated by it. But she seemed to have stripped bare the essence of what it was to be female in a world which was anti-feminist, anti-woman. And I remember it occurred to me that if Jane Austen's characters, female characters, had been moved forward a century, they too might have been the same kind of class passivity. Because the thing about those women is you want to say to them, get a job for God's sake, do something with your life. And when they do get jobs, they're absolutely terrible at them. So they have no instincts for self-preservation. And the other thing about them, which I think fascinated us, was they were on the brink of middle age. And we were young and we thought that we were born to stay young forever. And for the first time, we saw what happens to women when your looks go, what happens to women in a men's world. So they're very, very provocative and very fascinating and very frightened. But also, and I'll come back to this later, she was the great stylist.
Oh, yes, I think we want to know more about that, certainly. And Shivanee, what about you? When did you first encounter Rhys?
I was 15 or 16, and I encountered her in secondary school through Wide Sargasso Sea, which would have been similar to the educational experiences of my peers in Trinidad and Tobago and across the Caribbean. I know that many of my colleagues suffered through Rhys. I was immediately ensorcelled by her. And for most of my life, I have had to push back quite hard against the idea from educators, from fellow writers, that I was somehow romanticizing Rhys, which I'm eager to talk about a bit later on. People would say, oh, don't you know, she had such a terrible, painful life. She was struck by poverty. She died and no one knew who she was. She felt that her own fame had come too late, as if it made her strangely an exotic figure, something to aspire to, in the sense that a writer should suffer and be grateful for it, but it was never that with me and her. And through Wide Sargasso Sea, I found and devoured all of her novels shortly thereafter. My relationship with Rhys has been, I think, the defining one in my career as a poet, as a writer, as someone who cares about and fights for Caribbean literatures. I am helplessly in love with her, and I don't think I can stop being.
I think you're at the right place, if that's the case. It's interesting that both you and Linda sort of issued caveats, or you feel as though there were caveats about why you would like Rhys. That the plots are about women waiting for the check, or that we're romanticizing them, as though we're almost guilty about loving Rhys. But I want to ask you about the title of our event, which is What is So Great About Rhys? And it's a very mischievous sort of title, I should say. But I wonder if we can use it instructively to think about whether great is the right word to describe Rhys, or if there is a better word, and if she is great, what is the particular thing that makes her so great? Lauren, maybe you could have a go.
Gosh, I don't even know where to start. I've been writing about Rhys really intensely, or I was for about 10 years, between 2007 and 2017, in my PhD and essays after that in Unfinished. And I've had some distance now from her, and every so often you see her mentioned in the press, in the mainstream press, and it's just, as Linda and Shivanee have pointed out, it's just kind of relentlessly reducing her to this like doomed passive figure who, gets by, kind of like a crypto prostitute or something, sex worker, like someone who's just like sleeping with men to get by. And that is there, but she's really, it's such a complex kind of feminist project of asking us to look beyond, Linda, as you were saying, this kind of feisty, can do a scrappy, can, make a kind of happy story from, a sad beginning to a happy ending. It's, as Shivanee just pointed out, there's kind of ups and downs and bumps, and then at the end there's, wow, she's this amazing writer, and everyone gets to know this about her. But I reread Good Morning Midnight for this event, and it's just astonishing what a masterpiece this book is. It is so rich. It is so elliptical. It is so like just one of the great, I think, texts of the 20th century. You know, it's modernism at its best. And it's late modernist. It's written, you know, it's published in 1937. It has all of that history behind it of Woolf and Joyce. And it's, of course, she's of course building on, you know, the prior kind of Paris novels that she'd published in the 1930s. But it's really like no holds barred, taking on what it is to be a woman, a, you know, lower middle class woman with no money in this society, and looking at the way that that society at that time chewed up and spit out people who weren't like happy bourgeois, you know, come from a good family, father has a lot of money. So, you know, people who make this kind of critique of Rhys as this like whiny woman, why doesn't she just get a job? She is a major social writer kind of condemning her social system. And she is not just a, you know, white woman or, you know, mixed race woman lamenting her lot and, you know, out at a cafe for a drink and a lay. She's like, you know, asking us to rethink what we're doing and how we live in the world. She's a major ethical voice. Anyway, sorry, I'm going on.
No, I think you're supposed to go on in this event about Rhys. Linda, what do you think? You sort of suggested that Rhys is perhaps a great stylist. Maybe is that what makes her great?
She's an extraordinary prose writer. I remember having lunch, this is quite a long time ago, about 25 years ago, with an eminent publisher, and raising the question of Jean Rhys, raising Jean Rhys as someone I really venerated as a writer. He said, "Who do you rate?" And I said, "Jean Rhys." And he sort of looked at me rather quizzically and he said, "Really? I mean, I put her on a par with Evelyn Waugh." And in a way, that's a good thing, because I think Evelyn Waugh is a very great writer and a writer who's had plenty of recognition. But I think she's better than Evelyn Waugh. And the reason is I can't see what she's doing. I cannot see how she does it. There are no rhetorical flourishes. There are no fireworks. The sentences are short. They're quite unadorned. There's very little in the way of adjectives or adverbs, and then suddenly you turn a page and everything has led you on to being punched in the solar plexus by one sentence. So I don't understand how she is doing what she's doing, but she's doing it. I mean, she's like Vermeer to me. I mean, it's perfect. She's like Bach. She writes in a way which is pellucid. You can sort of see through it. And it seems to be coming from a very precise place in the brain where she is totally in control of what she's saying. And I would place her amongst the highest rank with Virginia Woolf and with Joyce. I think the problem was that she went out of print because nobody would publish her. And nobody would publish her because of her subject matter, because she was considered to be too depressing.
Thank you, Linda. What about you, Shivanee? I mean, you've already professed your love. What do you think makes Rhys great?
Gosh, the title of our event is so endlessly provocative, and I think because what I hope is that during our discussion and immediately following it, everyone who's tuned in will run out into the world in, you know, a coronavirus safe fashion. So maybe run their online shopping carts and get all of her books, get her entire catalog of work. I felt myself nodding like a bobble-headed doll at everything Linda said. There is no more perfect writer to me than Rhys. And to return again to White Sargasso Sea, it is what I think of as a perfect novel. And the truth is, I don't think of any other novel as perfect. But for me, it is a book that resides on its own in a very real way. I think endlessly of Baldwin's imperative to write a sentence that is as clean as a bone, and that is exactly what Rhys has done in White Sargasso Sea. I feel, just like Linda said, assaulted, haunted, but utterly captivated. There is a need to keep turning the page. There's a need to be synaptically linked to this plot on a sentence by sentence and word by word basis. And I've never encountered that anywhere else.
It's awfully moving to hear you talk about her like this, and particularly about Wide Sargasso Sea. But I think one of the tricky things about Rhys is, of course, the enormous impact of Wide Sargasso Sea. And before we get to that, I wonder if we could talk about some of her early work. And I know, Linda, you're interested in the early novels, as you've mentioned, and you've selected a reading for us from one of them. Will you tell us about what you're about to read just before you read it?
Yeah, this is after leaving Mr. Mackenzie, which was published in
1931, I think.
1931, so it's very early. This is my original copy. It's got my name in it, and I purchased it in July 1980. So this is it. This is my copy. And Julia has fled from Paris, where she has not left Mr. Mackenzie. Mr. Mackenzie has left her, and she's fled back to London to see if she can make it there. Well, I say make it, but and she's got in touch with her sister, who is looking after her very ill mother, with a friend. And this is Julia trying to get some money out of her sister. So this is Nora, the older sister, younger sister actually. Nora herself was labelled for all to see. She was labelled middle class, no money, hardly enough to keep herself in clean linen, and yet scrupulously, fiercely clean, but with all the daintiness and prettiness perforce cut out. Everything about her betrayed the woman who had been brought up to certain tastes, then left without the money to gratify them, trained to certain opinions which forbid her even the relief of rebellion against her lot, yet holding desperately to both her tastes and her opinions. Her expression was not suppressed or timid, as with so many of her kind. Her face was dark and still, with something fierce underlying the stillness. She said, "Do you know, I'm afraid I must go now. What time will you come round tomorrow?" "Look here, Nora," said Julia. "It isn't that I want to bother you, but I came over without much money. I've only got a little over £1 left. I won't be able to stay in this place much longer." Nora opened her eyes widely and said in a cold voice, "I've got £8, and that's got to last for a month, and the doctor comes nearly every day. Count up for yourself." "I know," said Julia eagerly. "I know. I don't want you to lend me the money. I know perfectly well that you can't. I simply thought you might let me stay at the flat for a few days till I get an answer from a man I've written to."
Thank you so much. Why did you select that extract in particular?
Because it's absolutely quintessential. It's about money. It's about the need for money. It's about the longing for nice clothes. You know, this could be a character in a Jane Austen novel who's fallen down on her luck and is still clinging on to respectability. It's about women's place in the world and how important money is and how difficult it is for women to get it except through a man. It looks at what happens when you haven't got enough money to have the right to express your opinions, when you're not attractive enough to hold your own in the world. I mean, it's terrifying stuff.
Yeah, thank you for that. I know that novel is the second of the early quartet, and the character of Julia is often regarded as a kind of a version of Jean Rhys, isn't it? I think there's a certain resemblance. And Lauren, I wanted to ask you about this, because there is an idea that there are all these autobiographical elements to Rhys's work. Can you tell me more about that and what that does to how we understand Rhys as a novelist?
Yeah, the sort of autobiographical status of the earlier novels has been kind of a major issue in criticism of Rhys, and feminist critics for a long time were trying to argue that what people called the Rhys woman, as if she's one person unchanging, is completely inappropriate, and it denies Rhys any kind of craft or skill as a writer, that it's it makes it just kind of diary jottings and not much else, as if diary jottings weren't themselves like a wonderful genre of writing. But I think that, you know, we can acknowledge, there is a way to acknowledge that a lot of this was lived, not all of it, but, you know, a good amount of it was autobiographically inspired. And Rhys herself really went back and forth about this throughout her life. She would say to different people, you know, she said to David Plant at one point, I can't make things up. I can't invent. I have no imagination. I just write about what happened. And then she would say to her executor, Francis Wyndham, Quartet wasn't an autobiography. Some of it was lived, but it wasn't what happened. And then so late, at another point, she kind of elaborates and says, like, basically, I begin with a fact and then something happens to it, like it goes somewhere. And so I think that's a much nicer way to think about Rhys as, you know, maybe like an originator, sorry, of autofiction. You know, it's a very common kind of term to throw in now, but she's really thinking about the relationship between lived reality and the fictional world of the novel. And I don't think that it's at all reductive to suggest that she is kind of exploring that kind of, I don't know, chemistry, that chemical reaction that can happen when you put the two together on the page.
I just want to say one brief thing about that. Jean Rhys's characters do fail at jobs that Jean Rhys also failed at, but none of her characters move in the literary world that she was.
Exactly.
So then they have no power, no influence. They have no connection to anything that might help them, which she did. So she's more knowing than those characters are. She's more connected.
That's really
yeah.
Yeah. Did you want to add to that, Lauren?
Oh, yeah. Just to say, yes, that's true. And also she married quite often, whereas the Rhys woman, you know, has that kind of early relationship with this man who leaves her in Quartet. He goes to prison, and you know, this kind of formative relationship that kind of breaks her. But in Rhys's life, you know, there were multiple entanglements, and she'd be writing about like kind of great precarity and precariousness when she herself was kind of settled down in Devon with a husband, you know, getting on with things.
Yeah. She writes across such a huge period and in such different ways. There's such variety in her writing, and you've already started to do this, but I wonder if you could place her in a literary tradition. And I mean that's almost technically, who should she be next to on a library shelf? And I wonder if you have differences on that. Shivanee, where does she belong in your bookshop?
Oh, I think I'm the worst person to ask that question, just because she has her own bookshelf in my all her books are, well, they're my mother's books, actually. They're the books that my mother, who also studied literature and who was an educator until she retired, bought. And my edition of White Sargasso Sea belongs to my mother. It's very old. It's falling apart. It's signed by her. It's a deeply precious object to me, and I'm not really sentimental about things. But I think if anything were to happen to this book, I would not be well. But so maybe that's interesting, the fact that in my house, she resides on her own shelf.
That is. Do you put her, well, maybe I'll ask you a bit more about the Caribbean context in a minute. But Linda, you mentioned war, but are there other writers too? I mean, I often think Virginia Woolf, but am I wrong? Or Elizabeth Bowen?
I think that there's a slight issue about Jean Rhys, which is that it's quite clear that White Sargasso Sea is her masterpiece. You know, I mean, I haven't been talking about it this evening, but it is the masterpiece. I mean, it stands out as something which is unlike anything anybody else was doing. And I scandalized a British Library audience a few years ago by saying I thought that it was greater than Jane Eyre. So you have two sets of novels, White Sargasso Sea and the 30s novels, and there is a bit of a chasm between them. There's a chasm in terms of time, there's a chasm in terms of subject matter, and it's very interesting to see her written about as an anti-colonial writer, because there's of course nothing of that in the previous works, and that I think is what makes it kind of hard to categorize her. I probably would put her next to Virginia Woolf. Yeah, that would be her closest soulmate. But I think that with Wide Sargasso Sea, possibly she pulled ahead.
Very controversial today, Linda. Lauren, what do you think?
I wrote about Rhys together with Woolf and Bowen for my PhD thesis. And so I read the three of them very closely as late modernists of, late 30s work that kind of fits together in a way. But I think we can really look at like this trend right now, or development maybe over the last couple of decades, of really stark and fragmented analytical writing by women. I think of Jenny Offill, for instance, Department of Speculation, as a book that I think is, comes out of a completely different time and place and sensibility and experience. But I think stylistically and feministically, if I can use that as a word, but just in terms of the way that it looks on the page, kind of not like dense paragraphs, like Jamesian kind of chunks of text, but like lots of space on the page. I think they look kind of visually similar. Renata Adler is also someone I would think of in this respect. Marguerite Duras in France. I think there's a real kind of tradition coming out of Rhys that we can read, in that kind of fragmented elliptical tradition.
I hadn't thought of Duras, but I think that's actually really wonderful alignment. We've been talking about library shelves. I should mention that this event is organised in association with the British Library, and predictably they have a marvellous collection of Rhys papers. And in fact, they mounted a dedicated display about her a few years ago, which you can look up online, and I think the RSL will share the link to it. It was curated by Sophie Oliver, and she wrote a little blog piece about it. And in that piece, she observes that, as you've described, Linda, Rhys has this revival in the 60s after all that early work. And it's curious that the interwar work, these stories about women and racial minorities, somehow seem to find their audience in the 60s and the 70s. And I wonder if that makes sense. Why does Rhys have this renewed resonance in the 60s and 70s?
Well, I think that what happens is, what Rhys does is she scrapes away everything which is unimportant about, or frivolous or temporal about being female, and gets down to the bones of it. And I think that was what fascinated us as young feminists in the 70s, that she was saying, look, this is the hard, harsh truth about what it is to be a woman, to be judged by your appearance, to constantly be, for aging. I remember it took me a long time to reread Jean Rhys, because I remember at the time thinking, I'm terrified of becoming a Jean Rhys character myself. I mean, it seems sort of unlikely now looking back at it, because I came from a completely different set of circumstances. But the idea of the lonely old woman whose looks had gone, who was in poverty and couldn't get out of it, was absolutely terrifying to us. And there is this a sort of yearning, a desire. She wants clothes, she wants sex, she wants love, she wants to be left alone, she wants money, she wants to be looked after, she also wants to be free. She wants a whole range of things which are incompatible, and her soul is kind of screaming out, and she's harried by life. She's constantly being pushed aside, she's being used, there's no place for her, where does she exist in the world? And it's heart-wrenching, and it's without any form of sentimentality and without any backstory either. She's just there. There is this woman who is, trying to take on life and not succeeding.
That woman sounds so familiar to me, Linda. When you said my soul is screaming out, I thought you were talking about mine. But let's talk about Wide Sargasso Sea, Shivanee. That was published in 1966, and it changed everything for Rhys. And I think you've selected an extract that you're going to read for us. Would you do that for us?
I have. I had a giant and passionate prelude as to why, but since you asked that after the fact, I'll let Rhys's writing speak for itself, which it always does. And then I'll tell a bit about why I've chosen this piece. But it is in the voice of the character who is commonly thought of, though he is not named explicitly in Wide Sargasso Sea, as Mr. Rochester. And they are leaving the island of Antoinette Causeway. If I was bound for hell, let it be hell. No more false heavens. No more damned magic. You hate me, and I hate you. We'll see who hates best. But first I will destroy your hatred. Now, my hate is colder, stronger, and you'll have no hate to warm yourself. You will have nothing. I did it too. I saw the hate go out of her eyes. I forced it out. And with the hate, her beauty. She was only a ghost in the gray daylight. Nothing left but hopelessness. Say die, and I will die. Say die, and watch me die. She lifted her eyes, blank, lovely eyes, mad eyes. I was tired of these people. I disliked their laughter and their tears, their flattery and envy, conceit and deceit, and I hated the place. I hated the mountains and the hills, the rivers and the rain. I hated the sunsets of whatever color. I hated its beauty and its magic and the secret I would never know. I hated its indifference and the cruelty which was part of its loveliness. Above all, I hated her, for she belonged to the magic and the loveliness. She had left me thirsty, and all my life would be thirst and longing for what I had lost before I found it.
Thank you so much. Will you tell us why you selected, well, tell us why this book matters to you, maybe?
Oh boy, how much time do we have?
Well, 15 minutes, but go for it.
When Rhys spoke about part of the impetus to write Wide Sargasso Sea, she describes Bertha Mason, who lives in Jean Eyre, as a kind of ghost, a sad one, a pitiable one, and wondered what that ghost might say for herself if she could speak up. And so there are some descriptions that classify Wide Sargasso Sea as a prequel to Jean Eyre, and I don't think that's quite right. At least that's not how I would put it. It is this great and sustained and forceful and very spare, like Linda is saying, answering back to a situation of a person from a place that's easy to consider as marginal. So Bertha Mason can be marginal because she's not in the direct ambit and focus of the great canon of British literature. It's easy to forget or misplace her, and it's easy for someone like her to set a house on fire. And Wide Sargasso Sea is the answering fire of that. And I chose to read the excerpt that comes from Mr. Rochester's voice because I detest him, and I think the great strength of Wide Sargasso Sea, one of many, is that Rhys may detest him too, but she fills his narrative with this keen desire for him to be understood, for his voice to be pellucid, for it to matter. And so we leave the novel not with an easy sense that he's a villain you can cast aside, but with an idea of what thwarted white male ambition looks like and how that moves in the world too, which is a driving force of the novel. And so no one is innocent in Wide Sargasso Sea, but some villains are much worse than others, and Jean Rhys does not let anyone get away with anything.
Linda earlier was talking about or explaining why Rhys might have had a different resonance in the 60s and 70s for women. And I wonder whether she has another, not just post-colonial resonance in our current moment, but a different kind of post-colonial resonance where we're once again reevaluating our relationship to literature. Are you thinking about the novel differently? And in this current moment, we're talking about decolonizing curriculums and canons and things. Are you rethinking her again right now?
So you can talk to
asking Shivanee that. Yes, just
right.
Yeah. But you can have thoughts on that too. But Shivanee,
I think it was really instructive to hear Lauren speak about some of the writers who are now writing in the tradition of Jean Rhys. And I think of how that has always applied to Caribbean space. It's hard for me to think of the novel as never having not been in a certain kind of gravitational force. And I think that's because I am Caribbean and because my focus is Caribbean literature. I mean, from people as great and luminary as Derek Walcott being inspired by Rhys and writing, I think one of his most beautiful poems is called Jean Rhys, and it imagines in this haunting speculation events that might have led to her writing White Sargasso Sea, to more contemporary writers like Tiffany Yannick, a novelist and a poet, whose work, and again, it's like I think Lauren is saying, you can't find a Rhys prototype or a Rhys duplicate out there in the world, but you can find people who are so strongly animated by the force and intensity of what she was doing that they can't help but be a little bit tugging at her hem for some resonance. And I believe that is true for so many Caribbean writers, more than I could name.
Yeah, I wonder about also the part that you read, and your confession earlier when you said you're guilty of romanticizing Rhys, but the extract that you read, the account of the Caribbean as magical and cruel. I wonder if you look at this account of the Caribbean as also romantic. Do Caribbean writers look at this Rhys's account of the Caribbean and think this is a kind of romanticized version of it? I just wonder what they understand of that depiction.
Well, I mentioned that I've been accused of romanticizing Rhys, not that I ever did. And so a lot of my time with Rhys has been fighting against that very easy assumption that other writers have made. I won't name names, but it's easy for me to look at the character of Mr. Rochester and to understand how he feels wounded and hard done by a place that he was only ever expecting to colonize and to appropriate, and to take the worldly goods and inheritances of Antoinette Causeway and to use it to his own ends. And colonizers don't expect a hard time when they go colonizing. I feel that was a tremendous response from Rhys in White Sargasso Sea, the idea that you can appropriate and you can decimate and you can rape and pillage, but the place that you are damaging can damage you back, and you might just have to admit that you can deserve that.
Wow, that's such an interesting way to think about it. And we've started talking about place and the very distinctive sense of place she has in all her novels. Lauren, in fact, I think you've got a reading for us too, and this is from novel Good Morning Midnight. Will you tell us about it just before you read it? So we have
Sure, yeah. So this is taken from the very beginning. It's the first 2 paragraphs or something, and then I've kind of sampled, I've pasted together a couple of other quotes from later moments in the book that I think are very relevant and good to hear kind of side by side with this. So it's about the hotel room that Sasha, the heroine of this novel, is staying in Paris. And so maybe I'll just read it and then I can say some more after it if you like. So this is the just very, very opening of Good Morning Midnight. Quite like old times, the room says. Yes? No? There are 2 beds, a big one for Madame and a smaller one on the opposite side for Monsieur. The wash basin is shut off by a curtain. It is a large room, the smell of cheap hotels faint, almost imperceptible. The street outside is narrow, cobblestoned, going sharply uphill and ending in a flight of steps, what they call an impasse. I have been here 5 days. I have decided on a place to eat in at midday, a place to eat in at night, a place to have my drink in after dinner. I have arranged my little life. My life, which seems so simple and monotonous, is really a complicated affair of cafes where they like me and cafes where they don't. Streets that are friendly, streets that aren't. Rooms where I might be happy, rooms where I shall never be. Looking glasses I look nice in, looking glasses I don't, dresses that will be lucky, dresses that won't, and so on. This damned room, It's saturated with the past. It's all the rooms I've ever slept in, all the streets I've ever walked in. Now the whole thing moves in an ordered, undulating procession past my eyes. Rooms, streets, streets, rooms, ... She likes an ellipsis.
Thanks so much for that. That's Good Morning Midnight from 1939. You've written about women walking the city. So is Rhys a flaneuse?
Well, so yeah, she is in a sense, and I really try to redefine the flaneuse as not necessarily a female version of a male kind of, man who just ambles around town with all the time in the world and all the privilege you could hope for. Not to go into a whole discussion of the book, but I'm trying to look at other ways in which women have walked the cities of major walked the streets of major capitals, and how they've interacted with the city, how there's been like a kind of mutually constitutive relationship. So for Rhys, she's such an interesting example. So I think we mentioned a little while ago, maybe we didn't, that she took up briefly with Ford Madox Ford. I think maybe Linda, when you were talking about how she was sort of networked into this group of writers that were quite well known and well connected. She had an affair with him. She lived with him and his common law wife, Stella Bowen, for a time. And he really helped her get her first book, the story collection, The Left Bank, published in 1927. And he writes in his introduction that he asked Rhys if she could, kind of like elaborate on her descriptions of Paris a little bit, like make the left bank sound kind of sexy. He doesn't use those terms, obviously, but, like describe it so that someone who's sitting in London and reading it, on a rainy, dark, gloomy day can feel like they've been transported to a cafe in Paris. And she says, not only am I not going to do that, but I'm going to cut out all the descriptions and all the kind of adjectives that might have even hinted at a romanticization of the city. So yeah, I think Rhys is someone who's looking at Paris as not a place that you want to glamorize and mythologize and, oh, don't you all want to have my life? She's really, as we've said, trying to lay bare, the dynamics of what it actually is to be a woman living in the city, walking in the city at that moment in history.
Linda, you're looking a bit thoughtful at that. Are you thinking?
No, yeah, the thing about her characters is that they're terribly modern in one sense, is that they're outsiders who are always being moved on, who have no sense of place, who are in exile from wherever it is that they last were, and are trying to go back, and are constantly in motion. I mean, nobody ever has their own place. They're always the women are always staying in hotels or bedsits. She arrives in a new city and says to a taxi driver, "Take me to a cheap hotel." And that's what our life is, a series of cheap hotels that get cheaper and cheaper. And in one short story, let them call it Jazz, she ends up in prison in Holloway, I think. So there is this sense of not belonging anywhere on the earth, of having no fixed place. And that's why I think it's interesting when she writes Wide Sargasso Sea, because then you have a sense of place, then you really have a sense of this is where she comes from. I just wanted to say something which occurred to me, and I wondered if Lauren knows the answer to this. The thing about Wide Sargasso Sea is, was it the first ever novel? It was the first I'd ever heard of at the time, to write from the point of view of a character in an existing work. Had that ever been done before?
I don't know. Shivanee, do you know?
Yeah, Shivanee, yeah.
I would imagine it was one of the first Caribbean books to do that, as far as the global audience who reads Rhys thinks of her as a Caribbean writer. I think they should, but that's an entirely different conversation. I can only imagine how the decision to do that and the publication of the book appearing in 1966 was received. I mean, Jean Rhys gets tons of enmity still, long after her death, for daring to trespass in those Brontean hallways. So if that's the way it is now, I can imagine what that would have been like at the time.
Yeah, I think I talked about the kind of how being stunned at the confidence and the accomplishment of that book. And I think you're right, Shivanee, to say that must be there, and that's really astonishing about the book. Linda, can I ask you about, we talked a moment about, or at the very beginning, we talked about our first encounters with Rhys, but what about reading Rhys later in life? Is there a difference now that you're coming back to her later in life?
It took me a long time to reread her. I mean, I felt that I had internalized her in a way. She's certainly, there are certain novelists that I come back to, you know, I come back to for pleasure. I don't really read Jean Rhys for that kind of pleasure. Not that kind of, you know, it's lockdown, I'm depressed, you know, what can I read that will cheer me up and it seems familiar? That's not, Jean Rhys is not my go-to for that, not the Paris novels at any rate. And so it took me a long time decades really, before I came back to her. And when I came back to her, it was the prose. It was the prose which, because I'd read so much in between and I thought, there's nobody else, nobody is touching her for what she's doing with a sentence. And I'm just lost in admiration for her for that. I still find her very hard, you know, hard to deal with, emotionally very difficult to deal with, but I admire her more. I admire her more. I don't have the same visceral feeling as I did when I was, you know, 23, 24, 25. But now I'm just sort of, I'm in awe of her, I think. That's probably the most accurate way of putting it.
Shivanee, what about you? Does she bear upon your own writing? I can't imagine that someone who is so enthralled by her wouldn't be impacted by that in their own work.
So much so. And it's a similar story to what Linda's expressing, in that when I read Wide Sargasso Sea for the first time and the second and maybe fourth time, all within the education system at different stages of it, there was a long period of time, about 10 years or so, where I didn't pick up not just Wide Sargasso Sea, but any of her books, having devoured all of them relatively soon after that first exploration. I think the reason was because they hurt me so badly, but also revealed so much to me. And they're absolutely not books that I turn to for pleasure, but they're books that I know will not let me down when I need revelation about why I do this precarious, capricious, sometimes wretched business of trying to think of myself as a writer or a poet. Rhys is somewhere in the foreground and the background and the whole haunted house of the answer to that. All of her books, all of her short stories, it's a bit heartbreaking to think that, you know, she is on record saying if she could do it all over again, that this whole business of being famous, of being a famous writer, had come too late. That, you know, things being even, she might choose just not to have lived her life in this way. And that's the thing I've been accused of romanticizing, that sense that a writer must suffer to make good art. So I'm not pleased that Jean Rhys suffered. I find the events and circumstances of her own life tragic and appalling. There was a long period of time between the early novels and Wide Sargasso Sea when people thought she was dead and referred to her as the late Jean Rhys in publications. And she herself said about that she felt a bit dismayed at having been found to be alive. I think a lot about those years, what she was doing in that time.
She feels very alive in this event, certainly. So I think, I hope to our audience too. Lauren, just before we turn to the audience, we've already started talking about this a little bit, but what about her influence and her legacy? Are there contemporary writers who seem indebted to her, do you think, or artists or anything really?
Well, as I was saying, I do think that someone like Jenny Offel is someone who has clearly taken quite a lot from Jean Rhys. And I mean, I was thinking, as Linda was talking just now, Shivanee was talking just now, about how easy it is to misread her, actually. That she does, it does seem like she's this self-pitying, wallowing kind of, I don't know, writer, but she's so not. If you really read her work, like look at it, look at the words on the page. First of all, she's like just hilariously funny, you know. There's a moment in Good Morning Midnight where she and this like kind of down on his luck Jewish painter sit down to have like a serious conversation about the act of weeping, like that, you know. And she's, the way that she says it is in this like very dry, sardonic, self-aware kind of, you know. So I think, again, without naming names, there has recently been some mention of Rhys by some prominent young female writers who just completely get her wrong and just write her off as like this sentimental, weepy old woman. And that's just, you know, she's just like she has such a sharp tongue, Jean Rhys, and it really comes through in her work. And I think that it's really important not to, as Shivanee says, romanticize her into some kind of, like pathetic figure. But to kind of be alive to just the prose and just the variety of colors that I think we find in her writing.
I have to say, I don't know the literary gossip, so whoever that is who's been bad-mouthing Jean Rhys, we're going to go and get them after this.
I think she thinks she was praising her.
Let's turn to our audience, who I think will only have lovely things to say. And I've got a few of their questions here, so I'm going to pose them to you. And I'm sorry if I don't get your questions, because there are so many of them, but they look amazing. So the first question from Sarah: Lauren said a little about Rhys's writing about money, and I think so did Linda. How unusual is the way she wrote about money and social structures? Are there other writers of the time that you think weave similar insights into their works? Does Lauren, Linda, Shivanee?
Well, Virginia Woolf never writes about money because she always assumes that it's there. And so I think it's very significant that money is so terribly important to her survival, that it's you're on a sort of sheet of tissue paper and you could fall through into real degradation. And those women are constantly on the edge of prostitution, just slipping. I mean, they sort of are prostitutes in a kind of a way. So money is immensely important to her, and I think that most of her contemporaries weren't writing about it at all.
I really don't think they were, no. I mean, Woolf does acknowledge it, you know, that you need your 500 pounds a year, and in 3 Guineas, you know, she's writing about women who need an education and need work, but she's writing about it from the position of someone who's never had to worry about it. And Rhys is very much in it, you know, kind of living day to day. So yeah, I'm really racking my brain. I'm sure there's some like Marxist male modernist who I'm not thinking of, like Wyndham Lewis or something, who maybe went there. Not that he's a Marxist, but you know, you get what I'm saying, a kind of like blokey guy. Maybe like George Orwell, down and out in Paris and London. That's probably the closest thing that I can think of off the top of my head. Yeah,
wasn't it?
Sorry?
That was kind of tourism on his part.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
I think that's right. Shivanee, there's a question from Edwin Marr. To what extent do you see Rhys as a Caribbean writer? Do you see Caribbean tropes and influences within her writing, particularly her 1930s novels, or do you see her literary influences as predominantly European?
I mean, Linda and Lauren have said quite a bit how the 30s novels don't gel with expectations of what a Caribbean novel does or should do. And of course, the truth is there is no such thing as a Caribbean novel, much like there is no a British or American novel. I mean, Rhys, the Dominican writer Gabrielle Bello has said beautifully that Rhys needed to leave her homeland to be able to write about it. So while you're not seeing explicit mentions to Dominica in the early works, there is very much that sense of outsiderness, of nowhereianness that is critical to how many Caribbean writers continue to see the world. In Gabrielle's own work, she talks about how being a trans writer who herself made a journey away from Dominica, how Rhys's writing and all of the writing, not just Wide Sargasso Sea, which, as we've discussed, is a different beast in so many ways from the other novels, empowered and also made the way clear to not only, first of all, give yourself the permission to think of yourself as an othered and nowherean writer, but to make good on that and to explore what that looks like, no matter who it upsets, whether it upsets people who still live at home in the Caribbean. And then, of course, the Caribbean is psychogeographical as much as it is based in any one solid place. Yes. How much is Jean Rhys a Caribbean writer? Completely 1 bajillion million%. I'm very bad at maths, but I'm completely convinced on that point.
There's another question from Fazia, and maybe it feels like it should go to Shivanee, but I think all of us should try to answer this, because questions about the colonial legacy or the post-colonialism of Rhys are questions for all of us, of course, because we all live in the shadow of colonialism. But Fazia says that it broke my heart when Shivanee said Rhys's house in Dominica was demolished this year. In what ways do you think Rhys showed the difficulties of being colonial despite being white in her life in Britain? Or was living in Britain a cause of hiraeth or homesickness, nostalgia and homecoming? So I don't know if anybody wants to have a go at that question. The difficulties of being white and colonial, and homesickness and exile and alienation, I guess, in Britain.
Her mother's family was Creole, as I understand it. So I think she had a more complex, I'm not claiming she wasn't, white, or I don't know how she saw herself, in terms of being white or mixed race, but that is, an important aspect of her identity. And she writes about that a good amount in Voyage in the Dark, where there are kind of direct evocations of Dominica, and it's there in the background. It's definitely, there's like a kind of oblique reference to it in Good Morning Midnight, in Quartet. Having come from some other place is like a structuring element, I think, of those books. But something an anecdote about Rhys's own biography that always sticks with me is, when she moved to Britain, to England from Dominica when she was 16, she went to theater school. She went to the Trees School, which is now the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art, and they tried to get her to change her voice. They said her voice was, they said some very unkind things that I am not going to reproduce here about her voice, but basically they were trying to get her to lower it at least an octave and to change, her inflections, because she wasn't quite white, they thought, from the way that she talked, and she refused. She said, my voice is my voice, and she dropped out. That was just it. It came down to a question of how she spoke and how she was representing herself, and she refused to be this kind of proper young received pronunciation English woman.
Yeah. Linda, did you want to have a go at that question?
No.
No, that's fine. I was just trying to find a quotation that I spotted on, I think it was on Wikipedia, about Rhys living in Devon, and I, like you, Lauren, I was really struck by the fact that she obviously had an accent from those early years and had to take elocution lessons, which is another way of being alienated, I guess, from white Englishness. But when she was living in Devon for the later part of her life, she described it as a dull spot which even drink can't enliven much, which I thought was very rude, but also sort of indicative of always being at angles maybe to home, whether it's Dominica or Britain. Let me ask another question. This is from, well, this is quite exciting. This is from Beth. During this event, the Booker Prize winner has been announced. So we don't know, we don't know who that winner is. Rhys wasn't an award winner in her life. Do you think that impacted the books we have, or hers, or the life of those works? I think this is a question about not being maybe recognised in the way.
I think that the sort of the literary prize culture had really sort of not taken off at that time. The first Booker Prize was 1969, so I don't think there was very much she'd been eligible for. So I probably think that's wouldn't have made, if she'd lived a bit longer and she'd gone on publishing, and if she published another White Sargasso Sea in 1975 and it had won the Booker Prize and become a bestseller, I think things could have been very, very different for her. But she died for, 1979? Is that when she died? So I think it potentially could have made a huge difference to her life if she had gone on writing for a bit longer.
Yeah. Do you want to know who the winner is? Or maybe it's nice to be in a state of suspended animation about the booker. Let me ask one last question from the audience. I'm so sorry we can't get through all of them. Shivanee, I think this is for you, although all of us could have a go at it. This is from Judith Allnut. It was noticeable in the passages which were read that Rhys uses repetition of words or phrases and rhythm in her writing to foreground a particular idea or theme. To what extent do you think of Rhys's writing as poetic? And is that an important part of its greatness? You're all nodding. Shivanee, you go first.
Yes, to all the extents and all the places those extents can go to. And perhaps that is, we're talking about, and we've spoken about Rhys's technical skill and her many competencies on the page. And if you are going as she did, to use language that was as spare and clean as a bone, you are doing the work of a poet. You are making every word count, and every connection between those words, every sentence has to be indispensable. And I think many poets that I know strive for that clarity, even in deep abstraction. And there are many complaints to Rhys being taught to students in secondary schools around the Caribbean suffering through her. But I have not heard a single complaint about the fact that she was not clear to understand in Wide Sargasso Sea. It is, I'm getting sidetracked by my great love for her. So I'm sorry, that's what you're witnessing right now. I think she would have made a very good going as a poet, though it would not, I think, have encouraged or made her financial circumstances any better in the times in which she lived. They might have been much worse.
Yeah. Linda?
Well, I must be a standard bearer for prose, I think, and say she was a novelist. She was not a poet. I mean, she had that spareness. You're absolutely right, but she was a novelist. She was invested in narrative. She was invested in telling you stories, which certainly begin in medias res after leaving Mr. Mackenzie. In fact, after leaving Mr. Mackenzie is what happens at the very last paragraph of the novel, when she sees him sitting in a cafe, and then she walks off. So she has a sort of a narrative structure as a writer of fiction, and I think she was very good at it. But you're right, her poetics are to do with what she's doing with language.
Let me ask one final question before we close, and very quickly, we only have a few minutes left, but if we really want to persuade our audience of Rhys's greatness, and which I don't think they need much more persuading, but assuming they haven't consumed everything, I think you said hoovered it up, Linda, earlier, where would you direct someone to really understand what's so great about Jean Rhys? So pick one thing. Somebody in the audience mentioned some of her short stories, so that might be a way to go, but what one thing would you direct us to read? Maybe Lauren, you go.
I mean, I'm going to say Good Morning Midnight. It's just like, it has all the great stuff about the Paris novels. And, you know, it's such a different project to Wide Sargasso Sea. I mean, I think that is, as we've all said, that's the masterpiece. So, but maybe people have already read that in school. So if you're going to start from, you know, maybe an informed nowhere, then Good Morning Midnight is the way to go.
Linda?
The same, Good Morning Midnight. It's the culmination of that, those 30s novels. It's where it all comes together.
And Shivanee?
Wide Sargasso Sea. I don't think it surprise anyone. I would say persist with it. Even if you had a bad experience with it in school, it's worth it now to return to that book if it's not new to you. But even if it is new, it's a tremendous place to begin backwards for Rhys's poetics, for the fact that, as Linda said, it is the most perfect novel I've ever encountered. Moving back in time from there feels like such a significant journey. In fact, I think it's a trip I'm going to take myself after such a long time of avoiding rereading Rhys. I think for fear of being just hurt with brilliance again. I think these times feel like they are demanding a certain kind of revelation. And I truly think I'm going to find it in returning to Rhys.
Thank you so much to Shivanee Ramlochan, Lauren Elkin and Linda Grant, and to our audience for really brilliant questions. I'm going to hand back over to Molly for some closing words.
Thank you so much, Shahida, Shivanee, Linda and Lauren. I swear we didn't do it on purpose, that it's all alliterative. If you want to come to events like these for free, please join the Royal Society of Literature. Membership starts at £40 a year and gives you free access to all the RSL's events, our publications, including a new quarterly newspaper, and our online book groups, which will be in person again as soon as it's safe for them to be so. In just over a week, on the 30th of November, which is a week on Monday, the RSL will be celebrating its 200th birthday with a raft of special announcements. Please join in with us then across the RSL's social media and sign up to our e-newsletter for special access to some of those announcements. You can register through our website, which is rsliterature.org. Our next event with the British Library, I am delighted to say, is on the 7th of December, when we'll be joined by Claudia Rankine and Philippe Sands for a discussion of the complex relationship between writing, truth and justice, chaired by Fatima Bhutto. RSL members can register through our website for free tickets, or public tickets can be bought through the British Library. A big final thank you from me to our partners for this evening at the NGC BoCAS Lit Fest, particularly Marina Solandi Brown. Thanks too to the British Library and my colleagues at the RSL, as well as our producers, Unique Media, for making tonight possible, and to all of you for joining us in the audience. Until next time, a final thank you to our speakers, and hope you have a good rest of your evening. Good night.